So Andrew asked me to talk about my new book, The Piracy Crusade. There's no way I'm going to be able to talk about 300 pages of book in 15 minutes. So instead, I'm going to focus on one very small part of the book that I think is especially relevant to Music Tech Fest. It's amazing how many, after all these years, after all these decades of digital music, how many new ideas there still are, or new configurations of old ideas. It's really inspiring to me after having kicked around as a music and technology analyst and journalist and entrepreneur and writer and researcher for so long, to see people still so inspired by what the technology can do and with so many exciting ideas about how it can change culture. So I'm going to be a Debbie Downer, and I'm actually going to talk about what makes digital music projects sometimes fail. And I'm going to read a portion of my book where I actually profile in the book a number of failed digital music projects. I'm only going to read about 2 of them because I don't have time to read the whole chapter. But there's a point here, and I'll get to the point after I do the reading. And by the way, those of you who have seen me speak before, I never read from anything. I'm a very kind of off-the-cuff, improvisatory speaker. But I think, I was thinking about this last night. I did such a good job in this book of writing these stories very concisely that I can't possibly do that in person live. So I'm going to just read you the concise versions, and then we can talk a little bit about why I think it matters to the people in this room. In 1999, few record label executives were more in touch with the brewing digital music revolution than Jeremy Silver. As vice president of new media at EMI, Silver was charged with granting licenses to deserving innovators. In his words, I had every single music internet company that had a new business model for music coming in to see me and putting their business plan across my desk. From his office on the 9th floor of Los Angeles' iconic Capitol Tower, he could see Hollywood spread out beneath him, and he was excited when he thought about the changes that would soon transform its business landscape. The problem was not everyone in the business or even within his own company was as excited as Silver was. As he told me, he'd been, quote, experiencing a degree of frustration with EMI at that point. Because even though he'd been busy granting licenses, often in exchange for big cash advances or equity stakes in the companies themselves, quote, we weren't actually developing our side of the deal to be able to really play ball. Silver might be granting innovators permission to use the content, but the label was dragging its heels when it came to providing these companies with access to the content itself. There was no in-house infrastructure to digitize and distribute the songs, nor were any of the associated assets such as videos and metadata readily available to licensees, and there was no effort to bring the bands themselves to the table to help augment and promote the services. It was as though the company were partially paralyzed, with Silver's department intent on moving forward and the rest of the organization refusing to budge. One day, a group of engineers came into his office. And though they didn't have much of a business plan, their technology piqued his interest. Remember, this is 1999. This is almost 2 decades ago. He decided that even if, quote, the music industry was visibly missing the boat, it didn't mean that he had to be left on the shore. In May 2000, Silver tendered his resignation at EMI and signed on as the executive vice president for the engineers' digital music startup, which was called Uplister. Anybody here ever use Uplister? It's been almost... Yeah, I mean, the process of writing this book, by the way, well, this chapter of the book, which is all interviews of and profiles of these defunct digital music startups, was like a real trip down memory lane. Because, of course, before academia, I was a music and technology industry analyst in New York for a firm called Jupiter, and it was my job for all these companies to come and show me what they were up to. So it was a real kind of nostalgic trip to remember, oh yeah, these guys had an awesome thing. So Uplister's basic premise was simple. If digitization was going to unbundle the traditional album, a fact that was already evident to many in the industry, music could be rebundled by the listeners in the form of playlists, which could then be searched and shared among the service's user base. Music itself might become ubiquitous and commoditized, but the service of providing access to songs, combined with the social platform catalyzing musical community through the act of sharing, would still be valuable and potentially profitable as an enterprise. When Uplister launched in September 2000, it had almost every piece in place. It had powerful and intuitive software for creating, sharing, and searching playlists, an enthusiastic early adopter community ready and willing to pay for the ability to use the service, and enough venture capital to last a year without revenues or additional cash infusions. The only missing things were the licenses from the major labels. Without them, the service could legally provide only 30-second clips of each song, a good proof of concept, but hardly a compelling proposition for music fans. Silver knew the licenses would be make or break for his company. Without them, he acknowledged, the service would be, quote, hugely inferior. It was much more exciting once you were able to turn all the music on. Yet he wasn't terribly concerned. As a recent EMI executive, Silver had little doubt that he would be greeted with open arms. After all, these executives were his friends and former colleagues, and besides, who knew better how to approach negotiations than someone who within recent memory had sat on both sides of the table? Silver now realizes that this expectation was evidence of his, quote, incredible naivete. True to the old saying, he found he couldn't go home again. As soon as I'd crossed that bridge and became someone in a technology company, he remembers, everything that we did was viewed with suspicion. Not only did the labels have, quote, fundamental business concerns regarding Uplister's ability to distribute music profitably based on an untested model, Silver also believes that personal feelings got in the way. In his words, there was this idea that these guys might go out and make a load of money that we're not making, and they might make a load of money on the back of our content, and he might make a load of money that he wasn't making with us. And I knew that because I'd sat there in plenty of meetings from the other side of the table feeling exactly like that about all these guys coming in, thinking, well, hang on, this sounds way too good, which is why I started to become part of it. In the end, the major labels never quite said no to Uplister. They simply never got around to saying yes, demanding millions of dollars apiece in advances and refusing to negotiate for a lower fee, even though the sums they asked would bankrupt the fledgling enterprise. Nor did they respond to Silver's appeals with any kind of enthusiasm or alacrity. As he described it, the major's attitude when there was a problem was, this is too difficult, we'll go really slowly. And for a venture-funded startup with a high burn rate in a rapidly evolving business and technological environment, this amounted to the kiss of death. Things were a bit better with the indie labels, who were much more interested, much more engaged, much more willing to experiment, and thus granted licenses to Uplister only a year or so after the company launched. Unfortunately, this proved too little too late. By September 2001, Uplister had about 750,000 users, 6 weeks of cash left in the bank, and 0 major label music on its site. As Silver recalls, quote, it was like we were in this race car, although someone had disabled the brakes, and we were headed for the wall. It was horrible. The dot-com bust earlier that year had made investors far more cautious, and venture capitalists were unwilling to pour more money into the company if it didn't have a fully functional service. Then came the attacks of September 11th, which froze investment entirely. Silver was forced to lay off his 35 employees. His wife and young children returned to their native England, and Uplister shut its doors permanently. Although Silver soon moved on to become the CEO of music composition software company Sibelius, his experience at Uplister has left him with a lingering sense of personal regret that starkly contrasts with his earlier optimism and enthusiasm. Quote, actually, it's quite painful thinking about it, he told me. It wasn't fun. Okay, now we flash forward. 7 years after Uplister closed its doors, a 24-year-old designer and DJ named Justin Ouellette, who had never heard of the company, came up with a similar idea. For years, he had been using the internet to keep track of his college radio playlists, both as a public service and as a personal diary of sorts. Having been an avid Napster user in high school, Ouellette knew that the internet was a powerful medium for music distribution, and to him it seemed, quote, like an incredibly tragic disconnect, that there was no simple way to turn his curated list of songs into an active, on-demand digital playlist. So he set out to remedy the problem. I just became sort of obsessed with why that couldn't happen, he told me. Why can't I just click on these songs and hear them right now? Because Ouellette's primary expertise was in design and his computer programming skills were only at the hobbyist level, and because he had a full-time job at the video sharing site Vimeo, he initially viewed his pet project strictly as a user interface experiment. After working nights tinkering on his playlist software for some time, he suddenly realized that it was 2 or 3 weeks away from being releasable. He quit his day job and buckled down, spending most of March 2008 in full-time development. Even at this point, however, he didn't view it necessarily as a career move. It was more of a creative challenge, a test of his minimalist design principles. He was basically exactly like the guys upstairs who were working on the music hackathon. He just wanted to make something beautiful that worked really well, because that didn't exist. So I want the whole site to be music, he told himself. Literally, the surface area of the site should have very few areas you could click on without hearing something. After 3 weeks of intense work on the project, which he dubbed Muxtape, any Muxtape users in the room? Muxtape? It was like there was the thing in 2008. Ouellette was ready to share his creation with the world. Because it wasn't initially intended as a commercial project, there was no marketing or promotion involved with its launch, though he was certainly optimistic about its social impact. He posted a screenshot of the Muxtape logo to his Tumblr blog and told his readers, "I'm proud to introduce Muxtape, a new way to share, discover, and listen to handpicked music online. My goal is nothing short of changing the way we consume, distribute, and discover music." The response was sudden and overwhelming, in part because of some of Justin's Tumblr readers were themselves influential bloggers. Within 4.5 hours, 1,000 people had signed up for the service. Within 24 hours, 35,000 people had visited the site, and 1/4 of them had signed up to use it, posting nearly 20,000 songs. This is within the first day of him just posting a screenshot to his Tumblr page. His post was the most reblogged item on Tumblr, and his site melted under the heavy strain of its exponential growth. But music fans weren't the only ones who responded quickly to Muxtape's release. The day after he launched the site, Ouellette started hearing from record labels. Universal Music Group was the first to contact him. The label's general counsel called Ouellette directly. How they got my contact information is still a mystery, he said, and, quote, asked where he should send the summons. Independent labels also emailed him, but unlike the majors, they were mostly inquisitive, not hostile or anything. Wow, I'm really onto something, Ouellette thought to himself. I should get a lawyer immediately. So he found a prominent music industry attorney willing to take him on a deferred compensation basis and immediately entered into negotiations with the labels big and small. He spent the entire summer in negotiations, all the while tending to his rapidly growing site. He found the process simultaneously fascinating and frustrating and absurd. It was real Jekyll and Hyde, he told me. It was weird because I'd have the business development people on one side of the table, and then on the other side of the table is the legal side. And the meeting would start, and the business side would say, "Justin, thanks for coming in. We love Muxtape. We use it in the office. It's so cool. Let's talk about some possibilities." And then I'd turn my head to the right, and the lawyers would be like, "We're going to sue you into the ground. We want the site shut down by the weekend. This won't stand. We're going to destroy you." And I'm like, you guys got to talk to each other. Decide whether you want to quash me or do a deal. But it's like literally having 2 different meetings at the same table. This is why I'm reading from the book. I can't make this stuff up, you know? This is amazing. So Ouellette was savvy enough to understand that this Jekyll and Hyde routine was essentially the label's version of good cop, bad cop. The threat of litigation, while real, wasn't immediate. Instead, the labels appeared to be using it as a form of leverage. This wasn't a problem as far as he was concerned. Once the licensing terms were worked out and he paid appropriate retroactive royalties for the site's first months of operation, everybody would get along just fine. His attitude toward the labels at the time, he told me, was, "You guys are snakes, but, you know, I can respect the game." It was clear to Ouellette that the 4 majors had conferred about terms, otherwise known as colluding, prior to their separate negotiations with Muxtape. They each offered essentially the same deal. The service would have to pay anywhere from 1/2 cent to 2 cents each time the song was played on the site. They'd have to share 50% of the advertising revenues with the majors, and they'd have to give each major an ownership stake in Muxtape ranging from 1 to 5%. Against these terms, the labels collectively required cash advances amounting to $10 or $15 million. Although he considered them onerous, Ouellette was willing to accept the label's terms as long as they'd allow him to go about his business in peace. "I'm not interested in being a millionaire," he told me. "What I really wanted was to build the best music experience," right? So again, this is somebody motivated entirely through an aesthetic love of music and design, right? Just like the guys upstairs. The problem from Ouellette's perspective was that even if he agreed to the financial terms, he still couldn't build the best music experience as he envisioned it. Some of the major labels also insisted on having some say in the project. For instance, demanding that Muxtape's front page dedicate a certain portion of its space to promoting major label bands. For an obsessive design geek, this was simply beyond the pale. I started to get freaked out a little bit, he recalls. What I want for my money is to be able to develop this product exactly the way I want to and with total transparency. I'm not going to turn this into a new payola. This is not going to be a new thing where the record industry gets to fuck it up just like they've fucked everything else up. Meanwhile, Ouellette had another problem on his hands. While he was theoretically willing to let the labels, quote, drink me dry in terms of money, potential Muxtape investors were not so sanguine about the proposed financial terms. As he discovered, there's a lot of music-loving venture capitalists in New York who could just not stomach the idea of paying that much money to a bunch of robber barons. Without the major label licenses, Muxtape would have cost $500,000 to become a viable business. With them, he needed to raise 30 times that amount just to get off the ground. Once Ouellette realized that he was essentially stuck between the rock of the major labels and the hard place of the VCs, it started to dawn on him that maybe this isn't going to work out. Unfortunately, Ouellette never made it past this point in the negotiations anyway. Out of the blue, he received an email from Amazon Web Services, which hosted the Muxtape site, saying it was going to shut down the server in 24 hours pursuant to legal action by the RIAA. He immediately called Amazon, with whom he'd been in acquisition talks, but they claimed to have no influence over their corporate sibling. He confronted the labels, with whom he'd been negotiating, and though none of them would cop to having ordered the closure, none of them were willing to make the call to the RIAA to stop it either. At this point, Muxtape was less than 6 months old. It had 600,000 active and enthusiastic users. It was the darling of the blogosphere and the mainstream media alike. And as far as Ouellette was concerned, it was dead in the water. Once the site was taken offline, it would lose the momentum it had enjoyed since its debut, and it would become, quote, toxic for any investor because of the cloudy legal outlook. And most important, Ouellette told me, I felt betrayed. I was like, this is not a negotiation in good faith. The labels had failed to live up to even his diminished expectations of how the game was played. So he pulled the plug on negotiations, closed down the site, and replaced it with a brief note saying that Muxtape will be unavailable for a brief period while we sort out a problem with the RIAA. After spending a long weekend feeling sad, Ouellette dedicated a few months to developing a new version of Muxtape, which bands and labels could use to post music as a form of self-promotion. That way, licenses wouldn't be necessary. After 6 months, he closed the doors on that as well. My heart wasn't in it in the same way anymore, he confessed. It just wasn't as interesting to me as a product. Today, Ouellette works at Tumblr, the site where Muxtape's story began, and he says he loves working there. If there's anywhere that the spirit of Muxtape is alive, it's in Tumblr. Despite his own venture's disappointing outcome, he acknowledges that that'll probably go down as the best year of my life. I don't have any real regrets. Nonetheless, he told me, there's one thing that continues to bother him. Quote, I still wish the state of music on the internet was better. So those are 2 of 5 stories that I tell in the book, and those are 2 of 1,000 different stories that I could tell, because this is a story that happens over and over and over and over again. And, you know, it's funny, I actually called up the head of licensing for the biggest music label, for Universal Music Group. Remember the guys who called him up the day after he launched on Tumblr and said, where should we send the summons? And I talked to this guy. His name is Larry Kenswell. He was the head of licensing at Universal Music from 1997 to 2008. And I said, what the fuck were you thinking? Right? There's 1,000 companies that came to you offering to revitalize your business, to do your R&D for you, to take on all the risk, to bring you new customers, to pioneer new ways of connecting your fans with your products. What the fuck were you thinking? And he was very forthright with me. Basically what Kenswell said to me, and this is a direct quote, he said the attitude at the labels at the time was, why license and make a little when you can sue and make a lot? So there's this very, 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 very short-term economic thinking where there's these multinational conglomerates, 6 major labels in 1999, down to 3 major labels today. They've got quarterly reports, they've got shareholders, they've got investors, they need to make happy. These guys were actually getting compensated. They were getting paid bonuses based on how much they could sue or extort out of the indie companies that would come to them. Jeremy Silver told me that when he was at EMI, they would talk about shaking the VC and the money would rain down like leaves, right? There was a very, very cynical attitude that continues to be prevalent among the major labels. The problem here is not that these labels are stupid. The problem is not even that they're corrupt, even though there are stupid people at them and the organizations work against their own best interests more often than not. The problem, and this is really what the book is about, and why I think that every single person at this event should care very heavily about these stories, is that we have a broken intellectual property system. We have a system that enables these short-sighted companies to essentially hold our collective culture hostage for millions and millions of dollars for cynical reasons that's never going to allow anybody to build anything that works or is beautiful. And that doesn't benefit anybody. It doesn't benefit the musicians, it doesn't benefit the record labels, and it sure as hell doesn't benefit us who love the music and just want to share it with one another. Now, this can be fixed, right? There is a compulsory license that allows radio stations to play music, and then they just have to pay a license to the rights holders. There are compulsory licenses that if you write a song, I can take that song and I can do a cover version of it on a CD or an MP3, and I just have to pay you the statutory rate, right? This takes the power out of the hands of the rights holders to hold songs hostage, but still gives them compensation when their music is used. We need to have a system that enables music licensing in a digital context to work the same way. We need a compulsory right to remix a song if we want to remix a song, and then pay the statutory rate back to the right holders. We need a compulsory right, if you want to distribute music over the internet, to be able to do so without asking permission of the record labels and the publishers, but just pay them a share of your revenues when you get some money. We need a compulsory right to be able to play with music as alpha and beta developers, as music hackers, without having to worry about getting sued for millions of dollars the next day. The good news is that right now, the Copyright Office of the United States is rethinking music licensing. The Copyright Office is going to be advising the US Congress about what the, quote, next great Copyright Act should look like. And between now and May 16th at copyright.gov, you can submit your idea for what music licensing should look like in the future. And in theory, at least, I don't know about in practice, I talk a lot about that in this book, but in theory at least, those ideas that you submit to the Copyright Office will play a role in influencing what the Copyright Office advises Congress to turn into law. So I advise every single one of you to go to Copyright.gov and submit your ideas to the Copyright Office before May 16th. Thank you very much. If anyone has any questions, I'd be happy to address them.